The offer on the house next door was accepted faster than I expected. There were no competing bids, no last-minute negotiations. The sellers had been carrying 2 mortgages for months after relocating for work, and the weight of an unsold property in a tightly regulated neighborhood had worn them down. The inspection report revealed no structural surprises. Cosmetic neglect had disguised solid construction. Within 30 days, the deed would transfer
Looking much better.
quietly into
Keep the
my
lines
name.
clean.
On the surface,
Great work,
it
team.
looked like
It's
a
really coming
straightforward
together.
investment decision.
The
But
audit
beneath the
confirms our
paperwork
reserves
and
are stable.
projections,
Stable?
there were
What about
layers
the
of tension
landscaping
that had
overrun?
been building
One-time
long
cost
before the
fully
first
justified.
violation notice ever
A
appeared.
$7,000
When we first moved
deficit?
into
This
the
is
neighborhood,
outrageous.
I
How
believed
could this have
structure
gone
equaled
unnoticed for
safety.
so long?
After years of working relentlessly to stabilize my finances and build a modest real estate portfolio, the idea of predictability felt comforting. My childhood had been marked by instability, rented apartments with thin walls, sudden relocations when landlords sold properties, neighborhoods where long-term planning felt impossible. I had promised myself that my children would grow up somewhere stable, somewhere orderly. Order, however, is not the same as control. In the beginning, the HOA's strict guidelines seemed reasonable. Lawn height limits. Exterior paint palettes. Trash bin concealment rules. These were common in suburban developments designed to protect shared investment. I understood the logic. Uniformity can signal care. Care can signal value. But over time, enforcement revealed something deeper. Certain homes appeared untouched by scrutiny despite visible infractions. Others, like mine, were monitored with precision. The pattern was subtle but consistent. I began documenting every notice, every time-stamped photograph, every fine amount. Not out of paranoia, but out of pattern recognition. The underlying struggle wasn't just about bicycles on grass. It was about belonging. My children were active, energetic, and visible. They rode scooters in the cul-de-sac. They drew chalk obstacle courses across the pavement. They hosted classmates for backyard birthday parties filled with motion and noise. Their presence disrupted the illusion of stillness that defined the neighborhood's aesthetic. Stillness photographs well. Stillness markets well. But stillness is not how children grow. The HOA president had lived in the community since its construction. Her identity was intertwined with its appearance. She chaired landscaping committees, oversaw holiday decor guidelines, and personally reviewed architectural modification requests. Her reputation rested on maintaining the neighborhood as a pristine product. In her worldview, deviation equaled decline. I understood something she didn't. Markets are not driven by silence. They are driven by demand, demographics, and economic cycles. Families seeking homes often value vibrancy as much as symmetry. Laughter does not reduce square footage. Chalk does not erode foundations. Yet perception can be weaponized. The language in the violation notices grew more pointed after the first fine. Phrases like community standard expectations and preservation of investment integrity appeared repeatedly. They were abstract enough to feel authoritative but vague enough to justify selective interpretation. Financially, I could absorb the fines without strain. My rental properties in neighboring cities generated steady cash flow. I maintained reserves specifically for opportunities that required decisive action. But the emotional cost of constant monitoring weighed heavier than the dollar amounts. My children began noticing the shift. They asked why I photographed their bikes before bringing them inside. They wondered why chalk drawings had to be washed away before sunset. I told them it was about neighborhood rules, about respect, about cooperation. I avoided explaining that some systems enforce compliance unevenly. Buying the house next door wasn't simply about proving a point. It was about reshaping leverage. Ownership in an HOA community translates directly into influence. Each property carries voting rights, assessment contributions, and standing in procedural matters. Most residents never consider this dimension. They see homes as shelter, not as strategic positions within governance structures. I saw both. As closing day approached, I ran deeper analyses. Comparable sales over the past 5 years showed steady appreciation regardless of minor aesthetic deviations. In fact, the highest sale in the neighborhood had gone to a family with 3 teenage athletes, their driveway often occupied by sports equipment. Market value had not suffered. The narrative about my children lowering property values lacked empirical support. But narratives, when repeated by authority, can shape perception. Renovation planning began before closing finalized. I outlined upgrades that would elevate the adjacent property above neighborhood averages without violating HOA guidelines. New exterior paint within approved color ranges but slightly warmer in tone. Modernized lighting fixtures. Drought-resistant landscaping that required less water yet looked intentional rather than ornamental. Each improvement would be documented meticulously. Permits would be secured publicly. Compliance would be undeniable. The underlying struggle extended beyond personal frustration. It was about challenging an unspoken hierarchy embedded within the community. Some residents had internalized the idea that conformity equaled superiority. Others remained silent to avoid scrutiny. I began attending HOA meetings not as a reactive homeowner but as an observer. I studied voting patterns. I reviewed meeting minutes from previous years. I examined budget allocations and reserve studies. I noticed that landscaping expenditures consistently exceeded projections while community event budgets remained minimal. The neighborhood invested heavily in appearance and sparingly in connection. That imbalance mirrored the broader tension. The day we closed on the second house, I stood briefly in its empty living room. Sunlight filtered through unwashed windows, illuminating dust particles suspended in still air. It felt like potential. Owning the property created a shift that no violation notice could undo. The president could continue citing chalk drawings, but she now shared a property line with someone who understood both market dynamics and governance procedures. The struggle was no longer one-sided. Yet beneath the strategy, there remained a quieter layer of motivation. I wanted my children to witness resilience expressed through action rather than anger. I wanted them to understand that systems can be navigated intelligently. That when confronted with unfair narratives, expansion can be more powerful than retreat. Renovations began gradually. Contractors arrived in marked vehicles. Materials were delivered in measured quantities. Neighbors noticed the activity. Curiosity replaced assumption. The house once seen as an eyesore began transforming visibly week by week. From her backyard, the HOA president observed the changes. The symmetry she prized now had to coexist with renovation scaffolding in progress. The underlying struggle was shifting from accusation to adaptation. And as the second property's curb appeal improved, the narrative that my family threatened property values grew increasingly difficult to sustain. The battlefield she had chosen, real estate perception, was becoming the very terrain on which her authority would be tested. Renovations have a way of exposing more than drywall and wiring. As the second house slowly transformed, so did the emotional landscape of the neighborhood. What had once felt like a silent standoff began shifting into something more layered, less about direct conflict and more about connection, perception, and quiet recalibration. The contractors worked methodically. Old siding was replaced. The faded exterior received a warmer, more modern tone within approved guidelines. Landscaping crews removed brittle shrubs and replaced them with native plants that felt intentional rather than ornamental. Every improvement was compliant, documented, and carefully executed. Nothing violated policy. Nothing invited fines. But something else began happening. Neighbors who had previously kept conversations brief started lingering at the curb. They commented on the upgrades. They asked about timelines. They shared stories of their own minor frustrations with approval processes and inconsistent enforcement. There was a hesitation in their voices, as if they were testing whether it was safe to admit that perfection had begun to feel suffocating. I listened more than I spoke. The truth was, the emotional toll of the previous months had not disappeared just because strategy was underway. My children had grown quieter about playing in the front yard. They asked permission more often before inviting friends over. Even as I assured them they had done nothing wrong, they had internalized the scrutiny. That realization unsettled me more than any fine. One evening, I watched them from the porch as they rode their bikes cautiously along the cul-de-sac. Their laughter returned in fragments, short bursts rather than carefree echoes. The neighborhood, once envisioned as a sanctuary, had briefly become a stage where they felt observed rather than welcomed. Buying the second house had been strategic. But it had also been protective. The transformation next door created an unexpected bridge. Activity normalized presence. Workers moved in and out. Materials stacked temporarily along the driveway. The visual disruption, so often cited in violation notices, suddenly became part of sanctioned improvement. It highlighted a subtle hypocrisy. Temporary inconvenience was acceptable when tied to property enhancement. But ongoing joy had been framed as liability. As the exterior upgrades neared completion, something shifted in the atmosphere. The HOA president continued her routines, her lawn still immaculate, her hedges trimmed to precise geometry. Yet the presence of renovation energy beside her property softened the sharpness of previous complaints. Perhaps proximity had introduced nuance. At the next HOA meeting, I attended not as a silent observer but as an engaged property owner with 2 addresses attached to my name. My questions were measured, procedural, rooted in documentation. I requested clarification on enforcement consistency metrics. I asked how market perception impact was evaluated. I cited comparable sales data demonstrating stable appreciation over the past 3 years. There were no raised voices. No confrontation. Only data. Other homeowners watched carefully. Some nodded subtly when statistics were presented. It became clear that many had accepted certain narratives without examining them. Numbers created an emotional bridge where argument could not. Meanwhile, my children helped plant small flowering shrubs along the side yard of the renovated house. Their hands pressed soil gently around roots. They stepped back to admire the alignment, not because a rule demanded symmetry, but because they took pride in the work. The simple act of participating in improvement altered their relationship with the neighborhood. Instead of feeling like intruders, they began to see themselves as contributors. A few houses down, a retired couple approached while we worked. They commented on how refreshing it was to see families investing energy into the community. They mentioned that they had raised children there years ago, back when the streets had felt louder and more spontaneous. The comment lingered. Somewhere along the way, the neighborhood had traded vitality for optics. The renovated property soon reached completion. Its appraisal exceeded initial projections. Comparable listings adjusted upward slightly. Market evidence quietly contradicted the narrative that activity diminished value. But beyond financial metrics, there was a subtler victory unfolding. Children from nearby homes began joining mine in the cul-de-sac again. Parents stood at the edges of driveways, talking casually. The presence of multiple families outdoors diluted the sense of singular scrutiny. Noise became communal rather than isolated. The emotional bridges extended further during a seasonal community event. Previously, gatherings had felt formal, almost curated. This time, attendance increased. Conversations felt less guarded. There was laughter that carried without immediate apology. I noticed the HOA president observing from a measured distance. Her posture remained composed, but the environment no longer revolved around her approval. The narrative had expanded beyond a single perspective. Owning the second property had shifted leverage, yes. But it had also created space, physical and emotional, for recalibration. I reflected on how easily perception can distort reality when left unchallenged. My children had never threatened property values. What had threatened the neighborhood was the narrowing definition of acceptability. Markets respond to desirability. And desirability is often rooted in warmth, safety, and community engagement as much as square footage. One afternoon, while reviewing updated sales data at my desk, I overheard unrestrained laughter from outside. I stepped to the window and saw a group of neighborhood kids drawing an elaborate chalk maze that stretched across multiple sections of sidewalk. No violation notice arrived that evening. The bridge between compliance and livability had begun to stabilize. For the first time since the first envelope appeared, the neighborhood felt less like a battleground and more like a shared space again. The tension had not vanished entirely. Systems rarely shift overnight, but it had softened. Emotional equilibrium does not come from dominance. It comes from balance. And balance was slowly returning, one renovated house, one planted shrub, and one restored burst of laughter at a time. Momentum changes the temperature of a neighborhood before anyone admits it out loud. By the time the renovated house next door officially hit its new appraisal benchmark, the atmosphere within the HOA had grown noticeably tighter. The transformation had not only improved curb appeal, it had shifted perception. Numbers were circulating informally among residents. Comparable sales were climbing. The narrative about declining property values no longer held weight. And when narratives collapse, those who relied on them often push back. The first sign of rising tension came in the form of procedural rigidity. New reminders were distributed emphasizing strict adherence to architectural guidelines. Inspection schedules became more frequent. Emails carried sharper language about maintaining community consistency. The tone was not explicitly confrontational, but it was defensive. The HOA president had built her authority on the premise of protection. If property values were rising without her hyper-enforcement tactics, the foundation of that authority weakened. The improvements next door stood as visible evidence that investment, not intimidation, strengthened communities. At the next board meeting, attendance doubled. Homeowners who had rarely shown interest in governance filled the chairs along the back wall. Some carried printed financial summaries. Others held copies of recent violation notices. There was a quiet electricity in the room, not chaos, but awareness. I presented updated market data calmly, referencing county records and recent sales within a 5-mile radius. Appreciation rates were steady. In fact, our neighborhood slightly outperformed comparable communities without aggressive enforcement patterns. The data spoke clearly, vibrancy had not diminished value. Then came the public challenge. A proposal surfaced from leadership suggesting expanded aesthetic compliance reviews for all properties, including pre-approval for visible outdoor recreational equipment. The justification cited maintaining long-term investment protection. It was framed as preventative policy. But the timing was unmistakable. The room shifted subtly as homeowners processed the implications. Expanded oversight meant expanded scrutiny. It meant more paperwork, more fees, more opportunities for selective enforcement. When the floor opened for commentary, voices rose, not angrily, but firmly. Residents shared experiences of minor infractions escalating into fines. Others questioned why enforcement seemed inconsistent across streets. A few mentioned that the renovated property next door had improved the entire block's appeal without triggering chaos. The tension crystallized into something undeniable. This was no longer about one family's bicycles. It was about governance philosophy. I requested a formal review of enforcement metrics over the past 3 years, number of violations issued per household, average fine amounts, resolution timelines. The request was procedural, within bylaws, and required documentation. The president's composure tightened. Transparency had once been optional. Now it was demanded publicly. Within days, homeowners began sharing archived violation letters in private community groups. Patterns emerged visually. Certain addresses appeared repeatedly. Others rarely, if ever. The discrepancies were not dramatic enough to constitute legal misconduct, but they were significant enough to erode trust. Meanwhile, the sale of the renovated house closed at a price that set a new high watermark for that side of the neighborhood. Real estate agents referenced it as a sign of strong demand. The closing price circulated quietly, then widely. The irony was no longer subtle. The family once accused of lowering property values had just established a new benchmark beside the very lawn that symbolized rigid perfection. Pressure mounted. An emergency HOA forum was scheduled to address community concerns. Attendance exceeded capacity. Residents stood along walls, some listening, others ready with prepared statements. The president defended her record methodically, citing dedication to standards and years of service. She argued that strict enforcement preserved order and prevented gradual decline. Her words were structured, polished, practiced. But the emotional current in the room had shifted. Homeowners no longer viewed enforcement as protective by default. They viewed it through the lens of lived experience. I spoke only when necessary. I emphasized balance. Standards, yes, but applied consistently and supported by measurable impact. Governance rooted in transparency rather than perception. Investment strengthened through community cohesion, not fear. The rising tension reached its peak when a motion was introduced to conduct an independent review of enforcement practices and financial allocations. The motion required a board vote. Silence filled the room during counting. The motion passed by a narrow but decisive margin. It wasn't a dramatic overthrow. It wasn't a public humiliation. It was something subtler and more powerful, institutional recalibration initiated collectively. After the meeting, clusters of neighbors remained outside under streetlights, discussing not conflict but possibility. The air felt lighter, though uncertainty lingered. Change always carries both. From her driveway, the HOA president stood momentarily alone before returning inside. Her lawn remained immaculate. Her hedges unchanged. But authority built on unquestioned narratives had fractured. Rising tension had forced the community into public challenge. And once a system is examined openly, it can never return to blind acceptance. That night, my children rode their bikes a little longer than usual. Not defiantly. Just freely. The sound of wheels against pavement carried through the cool air. No complaint arrived the next morning. The balance of power had shifted, not through confrontation, but through exposure. And the neighborhood would never feel quite the same again. Change rarely announces itself with a single dramatic moment. More often, it unfolds quietly, through documents reviewed late at night, through small inconsistencies that only become visible when placed side by side. The independent review committee began its work with routine diligence, expecting minor adjustments and procedural clarifications. What emerged instead was something no one had anticipated. The audit of enforcement practices confirmed uneven distribution of violations, just as many had suspected. Certain households had received multiple citations within short spans of time, while others with comparable infractions were left untouched. But inconsistency alone was not the revelation that shifted the neighborhood's foundation. It was the financial trail. Landscaping expenditures over the past 3 years had steadily increased beyond projected budgets. The overages were subtle at first glance, minor adjustments justified as seasonal fluctuations or aesthetic enhancements. Yet when charted across multiple fiscal cycles, the pattern revealed something more deliberate. A single landscaping contractor had been awarded recurring contracts without competitive bidding, despite bylaws recommending periodic vendor review. Payment increments coincided curiously with years in which violation fines also increased. The relationship wasn't illegal on its face, but it suggested alignment between heightened enforcement and expanded beautification spending. The neighborhood had been funding its own illusion of perfection. As the committee examined vendor records further, another detail surfaced. The contractor's business address matched a property owned by a limited liability company. That LLC, in turn, listed a registered agent whose surname matched the HOA president's maiden name. The connection wasn't explicitly disclosed in meeting minutes or vendor agreements. It wasn't criminal. But it was personal. The revelation landed with quiet force. It reframed years of hyper-enforcement and aesthetic obsession through a different lens. Maintaining immaculate landscaping wasn't just about community pride. It carried indirect financial benefit. The findings were documented meticulously before being presented at the next board session. There was no sensationalism, no accusations, only transparency. A request for clarification regarding vendor selection processes and conflict of interest disclosures. The room that evening felt heavier than previous gatherings. Word had spread that something significant had been uncovered. Residents filled seats early. Conversations hushed as the committee chair began summarizing findings. When the vendor connection was disclosed, a visible ripple moved through the audience. Not outrage, at least not immediately, but recalibration. People re-examined past assumptions. Strict enforcement now appeared intertwined with financial incentives, however indirect. The HOA president maintained composure, explaining that the landscaping company had delivered consistent quality and that the familial connection was distant and administrative rather than operational. She emphasized that no bylaws explicitly prohibited such arrangements. Technically, she was correct. But perception matters. And the perception had shifted irrevocably. Homeowners who once viewed her rigidity as dedication now questioned its impartiality. The fines, the citations, the relentless emphasis on curb appeal, all felt less neutral in hindsight. The unexpected revelation did something deeper than expose a vendor relationship. It illuminated the psychology of control. Authority justified by protecting property values had been intertwined with maintaining a visual standard that carried personal proximity to profit. The irony was almost poetic. My children's bicycles had been labeled economic threats, while aesthetic enhancements tied indirectly to leadership went unquestioned for years. The board voted to implement new vendor procurement policies requiring competitive bids and mandatory conflict of interest disclosures. The landscaping contract would be reopened for review at the end of its term. Financial oversight would expand. There was no dramatic resignation that night. No public disgrace. But the power dynamic had fundamentally shifted. After the meeting, neighbors spoke in lower, more reflective tones. Some expressed disappointment rather than anger. Others admitted they had long sensed imbalance but lacked proof. The revelation validated quiet instincts many had suppressed. Walking home under the streetlights, I felt neither triumph nor bitterness. What I felt was clarity. The issue had never been about revenge. It had been about equilibrium. The following weeks brought tangible adjustments. Violation notices decreased sharply. Communication from the board adopted more collaborative language. Community event budgets increased modestly, funding neighborhood gatherings that encouraged interaction rather than inspection. Landscaping remained tidy but less obsessively curated. Native plants replaced some ornamental symmetry. The neighborhood began to look less like a staged photograph and more like a lived-in environment. One afternoon, as I reviewed market updates, I noticed something unexpected. A real estate listing description for a nearby home highlighted active, family-friendly atmosphere as a selling point. The phrase stood out. Not pristine silence. Not rigid compliance. Family-friendly atmosphere. The market had spoken in its own quiet way. The biggest revelation, however, wasn't financial or procedural. It was personal. Weeks after the disclosure, the HOA president requested a private meeting with the board to step down from her role at the end of the fiscal year. She cited fatigue and the desire to allow fresh perspectives. The decision was framed as voluntary transition rather than consequence. Perhaps it was both. Power, once questioned, rarely feels the same to the one holding it. From my porch that evening, I watched my children race down the sidewalk, their chalk drawings stretching across multiple driveways with neighbors' permission. No one photographed them. No violation portal updates appeared. The house I had purchased beside hers had already been sold at a record-setting price. Its appreciation strengthened not only my portfolio but the neighborhood's comparables. The unexpected revelation had done more than expose a procedural oversight. It had dismantled a narrative built on fear of decline. And in its place, something steadier had begun to grow, transparency rooted not in accusation, but in shared accountability. For the first time since the first envelope arrived, the neighborhood felt honest. Not perfect. Honest. By the time the fiscal year ended, the neighborhood felt unmistakably different. Not radically transformed. Not chaotic or unrecognizable. The lawns were still trimmed. The sidewalks were still clean. Mailboxes still aligned neatly along the curb. But the tension that once hummed beneath the surface had softened into something steadier, something earned rather than enforced. The HOA president formally stepped down at the final annual meeting. There was no spectacle surrounding her departure. Her years of service were acknowledged. Her dedication to maintaining aesthetic standards was noted. But there was also a collective, unspoken understanding that the community was moving into a new phase. Leadership transitioned to a board structured around shared oversight rather than concentrated authority. Financial disclosures were standardized into quarterly public summaries. Vendor contracts required competitive bids and written conflict of interest affirmations. Enforcement policies were rewritten to include warning tiers and mediation options before fines. What had once felt like surveillance now felt procedural. The difference was subtle but powerful. My children didn't mark the change in bylaws or board structures. They marked it in minutes and freedom. They rode their bikes without glancing toward windows. They left chalk drawings overnight and woke to find them undisturbed. They invited friends over without asking whether the noise might impact market perception. That phrase had disappeared entirely from official communication. The house I had purchased next door had closed at a price that reset comparable values across the block. The appreciation validated every calculation I had made months earlier. The irony remained quietly satisfying. The very property adjacent to the source of conflict had become proof that vibrancy and value could coexist. But the true return on investment wasn't financial. It was cultural. The neighborhood began hosting informal gatherings again, driveway potlucks, seasonal decoration swaps, community yard sales. Participation increased each time. Residents who had once avoided attention found themselves engaging openly. Perfection had loosened its grip. Even the former HOA president's property shifted slightly over time. The hedges remained tidy, but seasonal flowers appeared where rigid symmetry once dominated. A bench replaced part of the stone border along her garden. It was not a dramatic change, but it suggested adaptation rather than resistance. Power, when recalibrated, often leaves behind traces of humility. As months passed, property values continued their steady climb. New buyers cited transparency and active community life as selling points. Real estate agents described the neighborhood as well-managed but welcoming. That balance became its new identity. I often thought back to the first violation notice, the one referencing my children as potential threats to property value. At the time, it felt personal, almost diminishing. Now, it felt small in comparison to what it had unintentionally triggered. The situation had offered a choice: shrink to fit an imposed standard or expand strategically within the system. I chose expansion. Not through confrontation. Not through hostility. But through ownership, transparency, and patience. There was a lesson in that approach that extended beyond homeowners associations or neighborhood politics. Systems, whether communities, workplaces, or markets, often resist change until someone engages them from within with clarity and leverage. Emotion can ignite awareness, but structure sustains it. My children would likely remember the period differently. They might recall a time when bikes were briefly questioned or chalk drawings washed away early. But they would also remember how quickly laughter returned. They would remember helping plant shrubs next door, seeing transformation unfold in real time. They would remember that when something felt unfair, retreat was not the only option. One evening, nearly a year after the board transition, I stood at the edge of the cul-de-sac watching a group of neighborhood kids organize an impromptu race. Parents chatted nearby. The setting sun cast long shadows across pavement decorated with faint chalk remnants. The scene looked ordinary. That was the victory. ordinary freedom, ordinary community, ordinary childhood. No one mentioned property values anymore. The market data continued to validate what had always been true. Desirability grows where people feel welcome. Stability strengthens where governance is transparent. Value increases where life exists naturally rather than under constant correction. The perfectly trimmed lawn next door still caught the light in precise lines. But it no longer symbolized control. It was simply one yard among many, part of a broader, healthier whole. As for me, I remained in the original house, my investment portfolio stronger than before, my understanding of leverage sharpened by lived experience. The second property had served its purpose and moved on to new owners who appreciated its warmth and design. Sometimes the most effective response to being underestimated is not argument. It is growth. The accusation that my children were lowering property values had once attempted to reduce them to numbers on a spreadsheet. Instead, it led to higher equity, stronger governance, and a more balanced community. And in the quiet hum of bikes on pavement, I found the final proof. Value was never threatened by joy. It was revealed by it.